As we have seen, questions of religion were intimately wound up with questions of politics, both local and global, during the 16th century. In this lecture, we will see how early modern rulers confronted the Reformation, sometimes using it as an excuse to increase their power, sometimes feeling personally driven to promote it or to eradicate it. As a result, as so often in history, a religious impulse, an argument about how best to worship God, would produce hatred, bloodshed, misery, and destruction. In the last lecture, we sought to explain how it was that the Reformation originated and survived. In this lecture, our first question is, how did it spread and take root in other parts of Europe, but not in others? Each country's situation is different. Let us therefore take a sort of Cook's tour of Protestant Europe. As we have seen, many princes in the Holy Roman Empire, especially in northern Germany, embraced the Reformation. They did so because they had humanist educations, or out of religious conviction, or maybe they wanted church lands, maybe they resented the emperor, maybe they were German nationalists and resented the Pope, and some did so because their merchants and peasants wanted them to do so. Now, in contrast, places like Bavaria and Austria, more directly under the emperor's control, stayed Catholic. What was the emperor's response? As we've seen, the emperor's initial attempt to get Luther to recant had failed. Charles condemned Luther, but he was preoccupied with his wars in Italy against France, and also with the resurgent Ottoman Empire that in 1529 laid siege to Vienna. If royal finances can affect religion, so can the international situation. In 1524, everybody in Germany was diverted by the Peasants' War. Peasants saw Luther's call for a priesthood of all believers as a general attack on hierarchy, and so they attacked their landlords, they plundered monasteries, they went on tax strike, and they demanded autonomy for their villages and the ability to name their own priests. Luther began by trying to mediate, but eventually he decided that the peasants had simply gone beyond the pale. He wrote a famous pamphlet called "Against the Murdering, Thieving Hordes of Peasants." I guess the idea is pretty clear. The Peasants' Rebellion was ruthlessly put down by the German princes. Over 100,000 peasants were killed. 2 years later, at the Diet of Speyer, Lutheran princes were granted the right to practice their religion. But 3 years after that, another Diet at Speyer reversed this toleration. The Lutheran princes who protested this became known as Protestants. In 1530-31, the Protestant princes banded together for their own protection to form something called the Schmalkaldic League. Pressed by the Turks, in 1532, Charles granted them some privileges in the Peace of Nuremberg. In other words, he's got to deal with the Turks, he can't deal with his own princes, but he was only biding his time. In 1546, after concluding peace with the French and the Turks, he launched the War of the Schmalkaldic League, in which, after initial success, he was eventually defeated. He was forced to agree to the Peace of Passau of 1552, reaffirmed at Augsburg in 1555, granting Lutheran states the free exercise of their religion. The consequences of Augsburg are immense. First, Charles V, by some measures the greatest monarch in Christendom, worn out with war and controversy, announced his intention to abdicate in 1556, retiring to a monastery 2 years later. Germany remained divided in religion and politics. The idea of a united Christendom under a Holy Roman Emperor had been repudiated forever. Now, in fact, Lutheranism had taken root elsewhere already. For example, the ambitious kings of both Sweden and Denmark had embraced it in the 1520s and 30s. The same was also true of much of Switzerland. Switzerland was a federation of self-governed city-state republics whose armies had defeated every attempt by the Holy Roman Emperor to subdue them. So here's another area where there's no central control. Basically, rural areas remained Catholic, but urban areas dominated by literate merchants embraced Protestantism and moral reform. This happened in Zurich, it happened in Basel, and most famously, it happened in Geneva. In the latter, the dominating figure was John Calvin, a French Protestant forced to flee his native country. Spurred on by Calvin's preaching, Geneva sought to become the Bible's shining city on the hill, a theocracy. In practice, a combination of democracy and strict restriction of freedom. First, the Genevan City Council reformed the liturgy and included congregational singing of psalms, very much a hallmark of Protestantism at this time. It also decreed public education for all and rigorous religious instruction of children. Pastors were elected, as were other parish officials. It also decreed the close monitoring of individual households and personal behavior by a consistory of clergy and lay people. Dancing, card playing, and gambling were forbidden in Calvin's Geneva. Its illegitimacy rates were famously low. That was true in part because notorious sinners were excommunicated and even put to death. Finally, Calvin founded a university to train preachers who became especially influential in France and Scotland. Let's talk a little bit about France. Protestant ideas were at first tolerated by the monarchy there, but on the morning of the 18th of October, 1534, Parisians awoke to find that upon going to church, a series of placards attacking the Mass had been attached to their church doors. The affair of the placards led to a royal crackdown. French Protestants fled to Geneva, where they were trained under Calvin. They returned in the 1550s, and in 1559, representatives of 66 Reformed churches drew up a platform based on the Geneva model. These French Protestants became known as Huguenots. Protestantism proved to be especially popular among the nobility, about a third converted, and in the cities among merchants. And of course, if you haven't figured out by now, Protestantism, with its emphasis on literacy, always did best in cities and among the aristocracy and middle classes. Royal attempts to suppress Protestantism would lead to the French Wars of Religion. Allow me to explain. France was increasingly divided into a Huguenot minority led by the Bourbon family, which was in turn headed by Henry of Bourbon. The Catholic majority was represented by the Catholic League, led by the Guise family. The royal house of Valois was caught in the middle. In 1559, Henry II suffered a sudden accidental death in a tournament. This guy stupidly forgot to put his visor down, and he was basically impaled on a lance. France was thereafter ruled in quick succession by weak, sickly boy kings. Francis II, who ruled 1559 to 60, Charles IX, 1560 to 74, and Henry III, 1574 to 89. The real power in France was the Queen Regent, Catherine de' Medici. At first, she tried to maintain a toleration which was periodically upset by assassinations of prominent figures on both sides. In 1572, under pressure from the Catholic faction, she authorized the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Protestant leaders were murdered in their beds. Parisian mobs took this as a signal to murder 3,000 of their fellow townsmen, and 10,000 more Protestants died in the countryside. The Pope responded by ordering church bells rung throughout Christendom. The result of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was disastrous for France. Decades of on-again, off-again civil war, atrocities committed on both sides, priests, ministers, and sometimes whole congregations massacred. France, weakened by internal division, would cease to play a major role on the international stage for almost 20 years. Let me now go north to the Low Countries, Netherlands, Flanders, and Luxembourg. These were ruled directly by Charles V, after 1554 by his son Philip, eventually Philip II of Spain. Protestantism was early embraced by the literate merchant classes. If you'll remember, the Netherlands is famous for its commercial power. Charles V ordered the burning of Lutheran books and imposed the Inquisition in 1522, not entirely successfully. By the mid-16th century, the Low Countries had split. The northern part, the Netherlands, was mostly Protestant. The southern part, Flanders, later Belgium, Roman Catholic. Moving across the Channel to England, England was staunchly Catholic at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, but medieval English kings had a long history of clashing with popes. In the mid-1520s, Henry VIII, heretofore a committed Catholic, began to seek a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had given birth to one living child, a girl named Mary, in 1514, and had not been pregnant for years. Henry was convinced that only a male could rule England. Remember that the Wars of the Roses were a living memory for many. He was further convinced that his marriage had been cursed by God because he had married his brother's widow. It didn't help that he had fallen for Anne Boleyn, a young, witty, Protestant lady-in-waiting to Catherine. The Pope, Clement VII, refused the divorce. Not because the Church did not believe in divorce. It had always granted, or usually granted, divorce for important people in the past. But that's the key. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, and Charles was a more important ruler. Moreover, to grant the divorce would be to repudiate the actions of a previous pope, Julius II, in granting a special dispensation for Henry to marry his brother's widow. To repudiate that would call into question lots of papal powers. And so Henry VIII, stymied in Rome but abetted by a compliant parliament in London, abolished the authority of the Pope in England and declared himself supreme head of the Church in 1534. He more or less granted his own divorce and married Anne. But that doesn't mean that he was a Protestant. In fact, Henry liked the ceremony and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. He actually wanted to be Catholic. He just didn't want to listen to the Pope. Some could argue that he was the first American Catholic. But realizing that Catholics would never be completely loyal, and they might always undo his royal supremacy, on his deathbed in 1547, he named Protestant tutors for his son, by yet another wife, Edward VI. Edward VI's ministers pursued Protestantism aggressively. They outlawed the Mass, they repealed the heresy statutes, they commissioned an English Book of Common Prayer. But Edward died in 1553, and he was succeeded by his older sister, who was a Catholic, Mary. Mary and her parliament tried to return England to Rome. They restored the spiritual authority of the Pope, the Mass, elaborate vestments, images, devotions, and the heresy laws. Mary Tudor launched a program of persecution, burning 286 men, women, and adolescents at the stake. Hence her nickname, Bloody Mary. Mary's Catholic restoration might nevertheless have succeeded, but she failed to produce an heir, and she died in November 1558. Henry's last remaining daughter, Elizabeth, needed to pacify a divided nation, and so she sought compromise. The settlement of 1559, once again, Parliament abolished the authority of the Pope and named Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church of England. Conservatives would never accept a female head. Parliament also restored the Protestant Book of Common Prayer, but it retained bishops, vestments, and many old Catholic ceremonies and holidays. I like to say that the Church of England thinks and writes Protestant, but looks and feels Catholic. Admittedly, die-hard Catholics tried to maintain their faith in secret, aided by missionary priests sent from Rome. Strict Protestants tried to purify the settlement of Catholic rituals. They became known as Puritans. But thanks in part to Elizabeth's long 45-year reign, most English men and women seem to have accepted the compromise settlement. England entered the 17th century a Protestant country, but with a rather milder form of Protestantism. Groups on either extreme who wanted to change it and were willing to engage in political activity and even violence to accomplish that. If you want to know more, I can recommend an excellent course in English history by Professor Robert Bucholz. Let us now move north to Scotland. Scotland was ruled by the House of Stuart. Now, this country had always been poorer, less centrally governed, its monarchy less powerful than England. After the death of James V in 1547, Scotland was effectively ruled by a regent, Mary of Guise, for her infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. I'm sorry there are so many Marys in this lecture. By 1557, Mary of Guise was alarmed by the violence that Protestant preachers, trained in Geneva like John Knox, were inciting against Catholicism, so she began to persecute them. In response, a group of Scottish nobles and lairds, small landowners, banded together, swearing to defend a Protestant congregation of God. In 1559, the lords of the congregation rebelled against the two Marys, abolished papal jurisdiction and the Mass. Both the French and the English sent troops, but in June 1560, Mary of Guise died, weakening the Catholic side. In July, all parties signed a truce, the Treaty of Edinburgh, which seemed to be a compromise which would allow religious toleration. But in 1567, after experiencing several years of Mary Queen of Scots' rule, much of the Scottish nobility rose. Some of this was Protestant lords seeing their chance, But Mary had also grown unpopular due to a series of marital disasters. I don't really have time to go into it. She had married the unstable Henry Lord Darnley and then run off with his murderer, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Over the course of 1567-8, the Scottish aristocracy deposed her in favor of her infant son, who became King James VI. James would rule Scotland till 1625, very successfully. Mary was forced to flee to England to seek the protection of her cousin Elizabeth, where she would be the focus for Catholic plots for the next 20 years. Scotland would remain Protestant, eventually embracing a Presbyterian-style church settlement. So, within half a century of Luther's Halloween prank, half of Europe had turned Protestant. Which raises the issue, what were the Catholics doing all this time? As we have seen, the Catholic response could be summed up in one word: slow. At first, the Church refused to take Luther's criticisms too seriously. After all, he was hardly the first. Popes rejected the call by many churchmen, including Luther, that there should be a general church council to work out these issues. They worried that such a council would attack the power of the Pope. And they failed to launch much of a Catholic propaganda effort. They sought obedience, not discussion. But eventually, the Church was forced to confront the breakup of Christendom and the loss of over half of Europe. It did so in three ways. First, the Council of Trent was finally called in 1543. It was convened to respond to the Reformation. Representatives from every Christian country came, and everything was on the table. This church council lasted 20 years, in part because it was interrupted by wars and politics, but also because its members realized that they would probably only get one shot. Indeed, the decisions made at Trent would shape the church until the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s. Now, tacitly, they conceded that Luther had been right about morality and discipline. They urged bishops to go live in their dioceses, and they reaffirmed the need for a moral and well-educated clergy. But they rejected the Protestant critique of church doctrine. They reaffirmed the authority of the Pope and tradition, the need to interpret Scripture within the Catholic tradition, the sanctity of the priesthood, all seven sacraments, salvation by faith in good works, purgatory, even indulgences, the use of images, and clerical celibacy. Finally, and less tangibly, the Council of Trent gave Catholic churchmen a sense of cohesion, a crusading vigor to match the Protestant reformers. In other words, reconciliation was impossible, the battle was joined. The most famous Catholic soldiers in that battle would be the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus was founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1534. He was a Spanish soldier wounded in battle. While recovering from those wounds, he experienced a series of intense visions and became convinced that God was calling him to found a community of religious men who would defend Roman Catholicism with the fervor and discipline of soldiers. In 1540, his new order was recognized by the Pope and sent all around the world. The Jesuits went to China and Japan and the coast of Africa and Canada, South America, producing lots of ethnographic information, the Jesuit relations, and establishing footholds for Catholicism. The Jesuits were also leaders in humanistic education. They immediately developed a following with ruling elites who sent their children to their schools. And they were sent to European countries. If Catholic, they became advisors and confessors to princes. In Protestant countries, they were sent ostensibly to defend and preserve Catholicism. But in both cases, they often found themselves involved in political intrigue and plots. In England, famously against Queen Elizabeth. In 1581, it was made high treason to be a priest in England. Over 250 Catholics, many of them Jesuit priests, were executed. Why? What were these plots? Why were Protestant leaders so fearful of Jesuits? Because they had the power and wealth of the Spanish Empire behind them. And that brings me to the third response to the Reformation, the Spanish Crusade. Spain, as you know, had long had a special relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. Its ruler's official title was His Catholic Majesty. Ferdinand and Isabella had persecuted Jews and Moors, embraced the Inquisition, authorized the forcible conversion of native peoples throughout their empires. Their successors, Charles I, who was also Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and especially Philip II, would use the immense power of Spain to attempt to turn back the Protestant tide. Philip II in particular was determined to use Spanish wealth and power in a great crusade against Protestantism. That crusade began in the 1560s with the revolt of the Netherlands. What happened was that in 1566, the Dutch Calvinists began attacking Catholic churches, destroying statues and stained glass as graven images. This practice is known as iconoclasm. In 1567, Philip responded by sending the Inquisition and the Spanish army under the Duke of Alba. Over 1,000 Dutch Calvinists were executed. This produced an open rebellion led by William of Orange, also known as William the Silent. The rebellion seesawed back and forth for decades. In 1574, Philip's poorly paid troops sacked Antwerp in what became known as the Spanish Fury. They slaughtered 7,000 people, and the port never fully recovered. By the mid-1580s, the Dutch were desperate. William the Silent had been assassinated, and a new army under Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, was taking town after town. The Dutch begged for assistance from the only major Protestant monarch in the neighborhood, Elizabeth I, who with much reluctance sent 6,000 troops. She had been secretly supplying the Dutch, in fact, for years. She had also secretly promoted privateers like Drake and Hawkins and Frobisher, who had terrorized Spanish colonies and shipping. So in this equation, Spain was, by modern American standards, perfectly within its rights when in July of 1588, it launched the Spanish Armada against what it considered to be a terrorist nation, England. Now, contrary to popular belief, Philip probably didn't want to actually rule England. What he wanted was to solve his piracy and insurgency problems, and he wanted a toleration for English Catholics. Pope Sixtus V, who rather admired Elizabeth, thought the Armada a foolish venture, but he granted his banner reluctantly. In fact, he was right. The Spanish Armada consisted of 130 ships, the largest ocean fleet assembled since ancient times. It carried up to 19,000 soldiers. There's some debate about the number. But the ships were slow and outgunned. The English, on the other hand, had about 50 faster, better-gunned warships in the Royal Navy. Since the English ships were faster, they were able to stand at long range, about 300 yards, and pound the Armada. But the latter held its formation as it proceeded up the English Channel in late July of 1588. When the Armada pulled into Calais on the 27th of July, the English sent in fire ships, nothing more than old ships that are piled high with stuff that burns, causing the Spanish to flee in chaos. This allowed the English gunfire to pick them off one by one, and at this point, the invasion was over. When the Spanish attempted to return to Spain by sailing north around Scotland and down the west coast of Ireland, they were battered by storms. About half of the Spanish Armada made it back to Spain safely. Now, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was a tremendous propaganda victory and confidence booster for the English. The storms which wrecked the Spanish Armada were dubbed a Protestant wind. The English came to see themselves as a new Israel, a chosen nation. But despite the loss of thousands of men and about 60 ships, the Armada defeat did not seriously weaken Spain. Spain was too big and too powerful. Thus, this was only the beginning of the war. It would last another 17 years. It would spread to 3 continents and 2 oceans, and it would drain the treasuries of both England and Spain. It would also drag in France. In 1589, a crazed Dominican seminarian assassinated Henry III, the last Valois king of France, because he wasn't Catholic enough. Now, ironically, the next in line for the throne was the Protestant leader of the Huguenots, Henry of Bourbon. I told you the Dominican was crazed. Needless to say, Henry was opposed by the Catholic League and their best friend, His Most Catholic Majesty, Philip II. Henry, desperate, called on Elizabeth. So now Western Europe had erupted into an all-out Protestant Catholic fight. Or if you will, it was Spain against the world. Turns out, you can't actually beat the whole world. By 1598, Henry IV had defeated his enemies in France. He appeased Catholics by becoming one, famously uttering the Machiavellian line, "Paris is worth a mass." He reassured Huguenots by granting a toleration, the Edict of Nantes of 1598. In theory, Protestants and Catholics would live side by side in France. In the end, that didn't work out so good, but we'll talk about it later. By 1605, both Philip II and Elizabeth were dead, and the Spanish monarchy had declared bankruptcy 3 times. As a result, both sides sued for peace, the Treaty of London of that year. In 1609, Spain finally called a truce with the Dutch, who established a republic, Protestant, but as we have seen, tolerant. What had Spain achieved out of its glorious anti-Protestant crusade? Well, in fact, not a single country had switched sides during this entire time. Protestant countries remained Protestant, Catholic countries remained Catholic. But on the other hand, Spain had received for her troubles exhaustion and impoverishment. And yet, the Spaniards were not about to give up. Phase 2 of the Wars of Religion would begin in 1618 with the 30 Years' War, which would, of course, obviously, last until 1648. Now, in the long term, the causes of the 30 Years' War were continued religious tension in Europe. In the short term, the Holy Roman Emperor wanted to roll back the privileges of the Protestants in Bohemia. And he's a Habsburg, so he's related to the kings of Spain. When he sent representatives in Prague in 1618, the civic leaders of Prague threw them out the window. This became known as the defenestration of Prague, fenestra being a word in both French and Italian for a window. The Bohemian Protestants then abjured their loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor and asked a Protestant, the Elector Palatine, he's a small prince on the Rhine, to be their king. The Elector Palatine ruled the Protestant kingdom of Bohemia for just 1 year. That's because the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain responded by defeating the Czechs at the Battle of the White Mountain, seizing Bohemia and the Palatinate on the Rhine, and in effect, spreading the 30 Years' War. The result was a general European war. The Catholic side consisted of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, in particular in the Habsburg ancestral lands of Austria and Bavaria. The Protestant side included Saxony and other North German states, technically part of the empire but exercising their independence, Sweden, the Netherlands, and France. And France is a key here. You see, it's true that these wars were wars, the 30 Years' War was a war about religion. But note that France is a Catholic country, and yet it's supporting the Protestant side. That tells us that the 30 Years' War was also about balance of power. Louis XIII's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, saw an opportunity to seize European control from Spain, to seize dominance from Spain, and make France the greatest power in Europe. Well, it took a while. The 30 Years' War raged for 30 years. Catholic and Protestant armies crisscrossed Central Europe, sacking towns, raping inhabitants, leaving devastation in their wake, all remember, in the name of how best to worship God. Neither side was really strong enough to crush the other, and finally both sides agreed to peace talks. The war was concluded by the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which enshrined this position, cuius regio, eius religio. In other words, whatever the ruler decides is the religion of the state, is the religion of the state. In other words, the great powers of Europe had finally agreed that some of them would be Catholic and some of them would be Protestant. Spain also finally recognized Dutch independence in the Treaty of Munster of 1648. Remember, the previous agreement had been a truce. Still, the Spanish wouldn't entirely give up. They didn't settle with France until the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659. The consequences of the 30 Years' War and this peace settlement are immense. First, the devastation of Central Europe. Some parts of Germany lost a third of their population. Germany itself would remain a disunited, divided country well into the 19th century. Failing to win the 30 Years' War is, in another sense, yet another nail in the coffin of the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. Indeed, the emperor would never again drive European politics. And neither would Spain. Spain was exhausted. Spain was chronically in debt after over a century of trying to fight evildoers on all fronts. Spain became a rotting hulk. On the other hand, England stayed out of it, and that was very smart. As we shall see, England had its own problems, but would emerge a major player at the end of the 17th century. And then there's France. With immense agricultural wealth, the French had subsidized other people's armies to fight on other people's soil. They had achieved a degree of dynastic stability by 1648. France, in fact, would be to the later 17th century what Spain had been to the 16th. Finally, the 30 Years' War and Peace of Westphalia discredited religious wars. Europeans drowning in blood had finally been forced to agree to live and let live. Religion would continue to divide them and would play a part in foreign policy for another century, but never again would they kill each other primarily over religion. This is very significant. Europeans had been obsessed with forcing everyone to conform, had engaged in murderous adventures over how best to worship God in a way that strikes us as well medieval. The notion that different European countries can be Protestant and Catholic and live together strikes me as being very, very modern and intensely rational. It is no accident that the 17th century would be known as the Age of Reason.